Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, FAFSA Verification Update, Reducing Melt with a More Targeted Approach. This is part 4 in our How to Pay for College webinar series. I'm your host, Kathy McDonald, Assistant Director for Network Partnerships with the Florida College Access Network. FCAN would like to thank Cornerstone funder Helios Education Foundation and supporters Wells Fargo and the National College Attainment Network for their generous support of the College Ready Florida initiatives and this webinar series. Today, I am thrilled to welcome on our call Maura Keller, who serves as Director of Technical Assistance for the National College Attainment Network. Maura provides professional development support to both direct service providers and managers to help ensure the effectiveness and sustainability of college access and success programs. She offers consultation services with advice on governance issues, programming, data collection, financial aid, research, statewide network development, and best practices. Ms. Keller also manages place-based grant projects and provides member support services. Maura has a bachelor's degree in education and a master's degree in higher education administration, both from the Ohio State University. I'm also thrilled to welcome today Raymond Alkazi, who's Policy and Advocacy Manager with the National College Attainment Network. In his role, he works to advance NCAN's federal and state policy agenda through policy analysis, issue tracking, and to build the advocacy capacity of their member programs. Prior to joining NCAN, Raymond served in a variety of policy and advocacy roles with Access Lex, Lumina, and City University of New York. Raymond received his master's in public policy from Georgetown University, where he completed a research fellowship through support from the Deloitte Foundation and his Bachelor of Science from Stony Brook University in New York. Before we get started today, a few housekeeping items. First, we welcome your questions. You can put those in the question box, which you should see on the right side of your computer if you're viewing from a desktop. If you're not quite seeing that, look for the orange box that has a white arrow in it that will open up your dashboard for you. Second, we would love to have you share what you're learning on social media. We'd love to know what's resonating with you. Please use the hashtag FCAN and the hashtag TalentStrongFL so we can find you. It probably wouldn't hurt to also connect with the National College Attainment Network there as well, because I'm sure they'd like to hear from you. Finally, this webinar is being recorded. All materials will be available within a week of the recording. You should see 3 handouts in your dashboard that include the slides, the report, and the one-pager that we'll be talking about today. If you don't see them in your dashboard, don't worry about it. We will send it to you after the webinar concludes. Now, for those folks who are new to FCAN and our work, our mission is to lead the collaborative movement to ensure every Floridian achieves an education beyond high school and a rewarding career. Our vision is to build a Florida working together where education is the pathway to economic mobility for all. We do our work in 3 primary ways. First is through our local college access networks that support 82% of the state's population. These are place-based organizations that are made up of community leaders who work together to create solutions and partnerships that support local talent development. FCAN also publishes research and data on evidence-based practices and policy opportunities to strengthen Florida's talent pool. Finally, FCAN coordinates 4 College Ready Florida initiatives that provide schools and community organizations resources to help students continue their education after high school. Our work is guided by our 7 conditions for success, which you can learn more about on our website. Our webinar today is a great example of many of these conditions, particularly clear information and guidance, affordability, and effective use of data. Now, to get us started with today's topic, as some of you may know who were on our part 1, 2, and 3, many students and families are confused about how to pay for college, and it can add to a lot of the stress involved in going to college. So to reduce some of that confusion, it's helpful to give them the broader picture of what the funding landscape looks like. So there's three main ways. The first is through family funds, such as savings and earnings from work. The second, and the bulk of it for most students, is financial aid, whether that's from federal, state, or school-based sources, or all of the above. And the third is through gap funding, which is often from scholarship sources outside of the school, like your local education or community foundation. It could be things like employer tuition assistance, etc. Again, you'll find this handout in your dashboard. It's important to know this landscape because for so many families, they're confused, and yet 4 out of 5 Florida college students receive some combination of federal, state, and school-based aid to pay for college, which means understanding financial aid and what's available to students is really important to helping them plan for their education after high school. In particular, 52% of Florida students are Pell Grant eligible. So for those that guide students in planning for college, it's not only important to get students to complete the FAFSA, which is what we're working on now, but in many cases, particularly with students from low-income families, we need to help them get through the verification process as well. That is why I am super excited to welcome onto the webinar today our friends at NCAN, who have been doing some great analytical work on the impact of FAFSA verification over the years in terms of how it hurts students and it costs higher education institutions. They have spotlighted that an alarming number of students are melting because of it and trying to come up with ways to make the necessary process less onerous on students. Their latest research found some really interesting findings that can help FSA and institutions take a more targeted approach to verification that can improve outcomes. So with that, I am going to turn the floor over to Raymond. Let me just give him the controls here, if I can get my my dashboard to cooperate there. There we go. All right, Ray, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Kathy, and thank you to FCAN for inviting us to present today on FAFSA verification. It was a lovely introduction and appreciate you all joining us for this very important topic. So the agenda for today is pretty simple, straightforward. We will do some level setting on FAFSA verification just so everyone joining today has context. We'll talk about the most recent study that NCAN did last year, which looked at data from federal student aid on the impact of verification on Pell awards. Then we'll transition to talk about some recent changes to verification, as well as verification relief in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. And then we'll talk about best practices for working with students, and we'll have time for Q&A. So to get us started, verification is an audit-like experience to prove that FAFSA information provided is accurate. Something important to note is that because verification can impact a student's expected family contribution, it can also have an impact on their Pell Grant award size. We like to highlight the burden that students and institutions face through the FAFSA verification process, and thinking about federal student aid's goal for verification, in their own words, is to prevent improper payments while balancing the burden that is placed on students and institutions. So FSA says that they flag profiles that are misaligned with expected values. That is their reasoning for verification. The students of whom they believe that their Pell Grant or their award might be not with what they are expecting. Right now, they use a machine learning algorithm to identify those individuals. So recently in 2018, 22% overall of FAFSA filers were selected for verification. This was a significant decrease from several years ago, where it was 30 to 38%, depending on the year. So noting that the 22% applies to all FAFSA filers, but that for students most inclined to receive Pell grants, those who are Pell eligible in most cases, the rate is much higher, approximately 50% depending on the year. We like to point out that the Internal Revenue Service overall audits less than 1% of tax filers. So, even 22% is high in comparison to that. So verification melt is a concept where students who are selected for verification do not complete that process. We like to think about this in terms of is verification really the point of conflict for the student, whether or not they decide to enroll. FSA had previously estimated verification melt at 11%, but in that same context acknowledged that other estimates were higher. FSA has just provided NCAN with data that revised this estimate, saying that 7% of students selected for verification do not receive subsidized aid as a result of that process. But noting that MELT for a variety of reasons is likely much higher. On the data that they gave us, 27% of students in a comparison group that did not go through verification also didn't receive subsidized aid. So in short, FSA acknowledges that MELT decreases when fewer filers are selected for verification. So there's obviously an association of some kind. So this is a new infographic based on the data that we have from FSA, as well as our own work, but of roughly 2 million high school seniors from low-income backgrounds who go through verification, as well as those who decide not to enroll for other reasons. Ultimately, only about just over a third of students from low-income backgrounds will enroll using subsidized aid, of which they are most likely eligible for. So to highlight the burden that is placed on students, institutions, and students' families, this is directly from releases by the Department of Education. It has the number of institutions impacted by verification, as well as the number of individuals. And really the takeaway here is that the burden hours, the estimates, which we believe are pretty conservative, are in the millions of hours each year for students, their families, and institutions. So even more recently, we heard from FSA at their annual conference this past December that the verification rate would be lower than, as I last mentioned, at a rate of about 18% of all filers. But the data that we have also confirms that the rate is much higher for students of whom are expected to be Pell eligible. 40% of Pell eligible applicants were selected for verification. And for Pell eligible high school seniors, that figure was even higher at 44%. So the 44%, or in a sense, a much higher number than the 18% of overall, still represents a common experience for many institutions and the students who attend there, that verification is still a major obstacle each year. So now I'm just going to quickly talk through the research that NCAN did using data provided to us by federal student aid with the Department of Education. And this is a copy. This paper was produced in support of the National Association of Student Financial Aid administrators. And this was part of a larger series of ways to explore FAFSA efficiency. So really just improving the process for applying for federal student aid. So our report looking at the relationship between FAFSA verification and actual receipt of Pell. We looked at data from 2 award cycles. That's the data that we received. One of the interesting components to this research is that the 2019-2020 year was the year that FSA moved to a machine learning model, and really their intent with this algorithm of sorts to improve the process, looking at these 2 years specifically allowed us to kind of track the trends, if you will. So couple things to note here: the data is only pertaining to those who completed verification, and it was up until the point of which data was collected by FSA. So the questions that we hope to answer through this research was for filers who completed verification, which our data is holistic. How do Pell awards change? We wanted to see how well FAFSA verification prevented improper payments, which is what FSA states this whole operation to be about. We wanted to look at how often Pell awards were decreasing versus increasing, and we wanted to think about some of the changes that the FAFSA verification process between the 2 years we looked at, and really what were those effects. So really this is the top takeaway in one chart. And what you can see here is that for both of the years, at least in kind of a percentage distribution look, very similar in terms of overall percent. And the top line here is that over 70% in both award years of those who were verified experienced no change to their Pell Grant award. And really, this is a reiteration of that data in table format, but another interesting point here in the percent change over these 2 award years is that less filers were selected in the latter year, and a pretty significant decrease in terms of sheer numbers, and the percent change explains that. So less FAFSA filers were selected for verification based on the data that we were provided. So again, we wanted to look at the decreases versus increases, and what we saw, if you were to kind of tally up these numbers, is that there were far more decreases than there were increases. The increases were mostly gathered in small changes, an increase of less than $500 in Pell Grant Award, whereas the decreases are pretty evenly distributed between that less than 500 bucket, but potentially over $2,000 in Pell Grant Award change. Another takeaway from our research is that only 3% of students who completed verification lost Pell Grant eligibility altogether. So really, this is a student whom before verification was expected to receive some type of Pell Award, and then after verification received none. And really, we're talking about a small number of students. For one example, you can see 900 high school seniors who were Auto 0 EFC, expected family contribution of 0, were lost Pell Grant eligibility as a result of verification. So now, again, with FSA's stated purpose to prevent improper payments, really this chart here is kind of the overall dollars that we're talking about. As you can see, the Pell Grant decreases are significantly higher than the Pell Grant increases. So more students are losing money through the verification process, expecting that they were receiving a higher award than after verification. That Pell Grant changed. And really the overall takeaway is based on what FSA says that they are trying to do, the model is producing net savings, which is really just more dollars are being reallocated than Pell Grant awards are increasing, and really that's the takeaway here. So again, our key findings are that over 70% of students who complete verification experience no change in Pell Grant award. Of the changes that we do see, decreases were twice as common as increases. Auto zero EFC filers are almost always going to retain that award. In the first year we looked at, it was 93%. In the second year, it was 96%. And that the process does result in net positive savings to the federal government in millions of dollars. So in terms of what FSA states is its intention, it is, at this point, it is achieving that result. So through this process, we gathered some policy recommendations. We would like federal student aid, which they have done to some extent, but to provide more explanation to the community as to why verifying 1 out of 5 FAFSA filers is the most appropriate percentage. We'd like to see an even smaller proportion of Auto Zero EFC applicants selected for verification, because in more than 9 out of 10 cases, those students are maintaining their award even after verification. And then, as my colleague Maura Lee will tell you about, we're paying close attention to changes that were enacted into law through the Future Act, which passed in December of 2019. So at this point, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Maura Lee Keller, who is going to talk through some of these considerations, as well as get to what many of you are interested in, which is how to work with students on FAFSA verification. Thank you.
Thanks, Ray. Thanks to Kathy and Florida for welcoming us and inviting us here today. Ray, if you could move the slide forward, that would be great. And yeah, there we go. You can go one more as well. So as Ray just kind of mentioned, I am going to talk about working with students, but we're going to talk about some other kind of concepts that are coming down the pike related to verification. So the Future Act, which was actually passed in December of 2019, and the Federal Student Aid Office was beginning to work on those changes. And then December of 2020, the Fafsa Simplification Act came along with all the legislation that happened near the end of December. And now there's 2 pieces of legislation that federal student aid is going to need to weave together. And it's going to have, we think, some pretty significant impact on the verification process. And, as we hope, with our fingers crossed, it means a reduction coming for verification. But in the Future Act, quite frankly, what it did is it allowed or amended a section in the IRS world that allows the direct sharing of federal taxpayer information with the Department of Education. We're used to now in the process going over, and for our folks who want to use the IRS DRT to transfer their tax information, there's kind of language. You see the screens pop up. It tells you that you're technically leaving the FSA system to go over and bring in your tax information. This new legislation will allow a direct transfer, so you, for lack of a better word, won't see those IRS DRT screens in the future when this is implemented. The great thing that we're hoping, since all the federal tax information, or FTI as it's referred to, is coming over from the IRS, it will be and should be considered as verified data. It should impact the process. It should reduce verification for all the income related fields, and it should reduce the burden both on the students and the institutions. Next slide, please. So, we know that kind of relief is coming, but what I want to do now is just spend a few minutes talking about some of the relief that happened, in a sense, as a result of COVID. And we're all this week everybody's kind of on their 1-year anniversary of COVID, and the department took some immediate action. And last year on April 3rd, they issued some relief guidance to the institutions about the verification process. And that guidance, as the pandemic wore on, was extended originally through December 31st, and now has been extended again, that all the relief offered in the verification process is in place until the end of the term following the national emergency situation being declared over. So if, for example, if they would declare September 1 that the national emergency is over, all the relief pieces would stay in place through the end of that term. And so probably, again, likely maybe through the end of 2021. It'll just really depend on the date and time when the national emergency is declared over. It gives the kinds of relief that were included in this. There were flexibility given to collecting verification documents that previously were required to be presented in person and or notarized. So there was sort of a waiver to those requirements. Students were going to be allowed to submit documents electronically or pictures of documents through secure portals. So many of the colleges who were maybe not already collecting verification information through an institutional portal set up some secure portals very quickly as a way for students to submit documentation. See, the reason that had to happen is many colleges sent their staff home. So there was going to be no one on campus to open, review, etc., items that were arriving in the US mail, and obviously if the offices were closed. Students could not appear in person. Students were allowed to submit copies of expired documents that may have been requested. For example, if a driver's license was requested trying to verify a student's identity, but it was expired, that was allowed because many of the agencies were not open in a timely manner for students to go in and renew those type of documents. Parent signatures were also waived when it wasn't realistic to secure a signature. So when we were in the situation where students may be in one city, parents in another, etc., those signatures were waived on verification forms. They could accept a signed and dated statement if they were trying to secure, for example, a high school transcript as a document. And if the school was not available, open to, release transcripts, they could sign a statement. Sometimes, depending on the timing, if the admissions office had a high school transcript on file, as a result of the application process, the financial aid office was allowed to consider that for documentation. As we all know, students were often required to submit a tax transcript, and often to get that, many of the students needed to complete the form 4506T, and they often mailed those in and waited on tax returns. The IRS, like other federal agencies, sent people home. So responding to paper documents became difficult. The department had previously, prior to COVID, and starting at the Federal Student Aid Conference prior to COVID, put out guidance and reminders to institutions that they were allowed, when students were having a difficult time securing either a tax transcript or a verification of non-filing letter, that they could accept copies of signed tax returns, or they could accept a statement signed by the student or parent that they were having a difficult time securing a verification of non-filing letter. Next slide, please. So it became very difficult for folks to secure documents. So some folks could still go on and get an IRS tax transcript if they could meet all the requirements to electronically download the form. But in many cases, the colleges became much more open and receptive to the ideas of receiving copies of signed tax returns. Also, those letters verifying of non-filer were almost impossible to access. So campuses around the country were accepting the signed statements, to submit to suffice as the documents required for verification. Also, along the way, as we know, lots of families, students, parents experienced job losses and things like that. So the Department of Education has spent a lot of time reminding colleges about professional judgment that they can use to make adjustments to the information that was filed. So we hope that, colleges kind of were listening to this in the past so that you maybe have an understanding from the higher ed perspective. Completing a lot of professional judgments at a campus may have been a red flag that went up at the department, and may have done something like helped get a campus selected for a federal audit. What the department was coming out and reassuring the colleges is that, with the tremendous income losses and things like that, you should be doing the PJ. And, for this time period, conducting a lot of professional judgment cases will not be a red flag and will not likely get your institution selected for an audit. So we are kind of really curious to see if anyone cares to type in the chat or question box, what are you experiencing? Did you see cases where colleges became more supportive and I'm not going to use the phrase relaxed verification requirements, but made a lot of accommodations so that students could get their information submitted and get verification processed so that the students would be eligible to receive their aid. So we'd love to see anything, good news or bad news, that you experienced during this past year. Please type that in the question box. Ray, the next form, please. Next slide. Now, when it comes to assisting the students, let me just prep you here to say, you're not going to find silver bullets on this page. We're going to talk about some practical things. Many of you may be nodding your head as I go through some of these going, yes, we do that. Yes, we do that. I wish we had uncovered some silver bullets that simply tore through the verification process and made it absolutely so easy. But this year, what we honestly have to talk about is the fact that FAFSA completion is behind all over the country. So before we can talk and focus on a lot of verification, we have to work and continue to work really hard with our current class of 2021 to get them to file the FAFSA. So we can't ignore that aspect, knowing that verification may be coming after they file, but we've got to try to gain back some ground in the FAFSA filing rate for this class of 2021. As Ray indicated, good news, the selection rate is going down. It'll be they're estimating about 18% for the overall filers. But as Ray indicated, so for our programs that work with a lot of low income students, so therefore Pell eligibles, the selection rate is not going to feel like 18% to you. It probably is going to feel closer to that 50% range. Half the students that file feel like they're selected for verification. And so, we're just going to have to continue to plow through. The 21-22 process is probably different than it was for 2021 due to the offices being closed and things like that. Many of your students from the class of 20 may have gotten verification completed before everyone was sent home in March. However, those who filed for the, this 21-22 year in a time frame when offices haven't been open and everything, so you may have had different experiences. What we do know, and whether we consider this good news or bad news, is that verification is a student by student and college by college process, because colleges will notify students in different ways that they've been selected. We all know to look for that asterisk when we see a student aid report. Um, the other issue is colleges will have different ways to notify students and then different ways to collect the documents. And so even helping a single student who's applied to multiple campuses, if they've applied to 5 different places, you may have 5 different ways in which the documentation has to be processed so that the student can complete verification on their campuses and get their award notification so they can make the decision about where they will be enrolling. The pandemic really amplified the complexity of this process. A lot of things we heard from folks around the country is, we can talk about the broadband issues and the internet access issues and things like that. In many cases, devices and hotspots and things like that were provided to students, but what didn't happen was the ability to have a printer at home and to print documents and then sign them and then scan them to upload them. So, the pandemic really added to complexity. And so much advising was done virtually by school counselors, by college access organizations, by the colleges. In a sense, what would we have done this year if we couldn't share screens and show documents and point people where to sign or what to fill in or things like that? It would have made this incredibly hard year even more ridiculous. Ray, next slide, please. So let's talk about a few things that we can do. One thing that we know is as students are accepted at institutions, a lot of times those institutions are very willing to give those incoming students access to the institutional portal. So students receive users names and passwords or create passwords. And so this year it was probably more than critical to make sure or to advise students and make sure they're keeping a log or track of their various usernames and passwords for the different college portals, particularly for our incoming students that are considering various colleges, because getting into a portal sometimes is half the battle. It represents making sure students understand their FSA ID username and password. Oftentimes we encourage programs to create a log at your organization or a step-by-step sheet at your organization for the colleges where the students you're serving are most likely to attend, right? And on that sheet, you can create 2 versions of it. You can create an internal version for what your advisors should know or do when they're assisting students, but you can you could also create a step-by-step document that you could share with students. But probably important information internally is to think about when and noting how students are notified, and probably also how documents are submitted. Some of our state organizations around the country who provide student level data to the school districts to know who has filed a FAFSA. Some of the states include an additional field that indicates whether a student was selected for verification or not. This can be really helpful in your outreach work. So a lot of times we're happy when we know students have filed the FAFSA. Maybe they've come out on the list, or the students have shared a student aid report. But also those states that do share that field about being selected for verification can really help you do some laser focus on your outreach. You want to use clever virtual options for pictures of documents, helping students create documents, upload them, and signatures. The number of stories I've heard this year about documents being sent back and forth so the organization can print it, the student can then get it signed, and then it comes back to the organization to be scanned and uploaded. So people have been getting very creative about passing documents back and forth. And that's the other thing that I mentioned earlier, that this is a process one student at a time, one college at a time. And you'll get familiar if you are in the advising role, school counselor, a college access advisor. You will become familiar with the process, particularly at the colleges most highly attended, and you'll kind of know. Some colleges will notify verification on a rolling basis. Others will hold FAFSA information to a certain date and then send out all their verification requests. The other thing we have to remember is that in many cases, verification requests may have a deadline date. That they want all the documents submitted by such and such a date. And that's usually related to the awarding and then the types of aid that the student may be eligible for when the award letters are issued. When you have questions, reach out to the colleges, but you got in several state cases, you're going to have the student with you depending on the type of question you're asking for FERPA compliance, because many of the college financial aid staff are not going to chat with you about an individual item, data element for the student. So you want to make sure that you're maybe on with the student, coaching the student through the questions that they'll ask the financial aid office. Next slide, please. Thinking back now about all the things you've heard from Ray, and as we look forward, we really right now are at a very critical point in FAFSA verification. We have that legislation from 2019, which is going to help us in a tremendous way bring over almost every single applicant's information from the IRS. The legislation that was passed in December of 2020 is a huge FAFSA simplification piece of legislation that's going to reduce the number of questions that students are going to have to complete, etc. So in that legislation, just for date and time reference, sort of the FAFSA legislation that was passed in 2020 says that all the FAFSA simplification, which of course would include the IRS transition, need to be in effect for the 23-24 academic year, which means the FAFSA that opens October 1, 2022 would have to be the new version of the FAFSA. So assuming that the Department and Federal Student Aid can meet that obligation, we are perhaps a year and a half away from a different type of FAFSA. Ray talked a lot about the evidence of cost and of Pell grant dollars saved versus the benefit. It is always interesting when you compare what rate students are selected for verification in the FAFSA process versus those that are selected for our IRS tax form audits. So that's always kind of an interesting comparison to keep in mind. How to make the post-secondary pathway easier for millions of students and accessing financial aid. I mean, that is the cliff that we are on right now to see what it looks like moving forward. We know, as Ray pointed out, the verification process does not change Pell Grant awards or changes them very slightly for the vast majority of filers. And so it is sad when we have to address verification melt. I mean, there are many other things that can happen to a student that would allow them to not enroll, but when we lose students because we can't get them through the verification process, probably one of the most frustrating experiences. We hope that our policymakers and all the financial aid officers and the department will continue to actively find ways to reduce obstacles so that we can get students graduated through this process into some type of post-secondary opportunity so that they can be earning credentials and degrees. NCAN will keep it at the core of what we do when it comes to advocacy to continue to get the verification burden reduced, along with meeting Federal Student Aid's goal of, program integrity and, making sure that taxpayer dollars are as well spent and getting that burden reduced for our students and our families. Next slide, please. Here's some resources that NCAN has available for you. So you'll have the handouts. So we've got policy work on the FAFSA. We've got blogs, papers, and then the NASPA paper series that Ray was referencing. So lots of resources available to you for those that want to do a deeper dive into this. Next slide, please. And again, Kathy, thanks for the invitation, and Ray and I will try to tackle any questions that may have come in ahead or while the presentation's been going on. Kathy, you're muted.
Thank you. One of these days, we will finally master technology and have that be a non-issue. So thank you to you both for sharing all of that great information. We have a bunch of great questions coming through. So a quickie for you is, does the asterisk on the SAR indicate verification? Cami wants to know.
Yes, that's how you know that the student was selected by the Department of Education for verification. Please note also, though, in terms of verification, there are institutions out there that choose to do 100% verification of all students, incoming and upper class. So the students will have to be aware of institutional policy, because sometimes students will be going through a verification process and will not have an asterisk on their student aid report, but that's because of an institutional policy.
Yeah, great distinction there. Okay, Tom wants to know, are the changes in Pell Grant awards as a result of verification the result of misrepresentation? So in other words, do we know what percent or how much it's more errors versus cheating or misunderstanding?
Morley, I was going to let you weigh there.
Okay. They're not going to like the answer. It's probably both, right?
Yeah.
There are some times when there are folks out there who attempt to complete a FAFSA and with incorrect information. Sometimes they are not as smart as completing a FAFSA incorrectly as they thought they would be, and the verification process may, for example, find an additional adult in the household whose income needs to be considered, or things like that. Sometimes it is straight up errors. Somebody didn't understand a question. Sometimes although there's warning, sometimes you see things like the parent repeats their income twice in their section and in the student section, and things like that. Hopefully those lead to Pell Grant increases versus decreases, but it is a little bit of both.
Yeah, okay. This one comes up a lot, and I know you all hear it. So does the new law permitting FAFSA to access taxes of parents eliminate the concern that some students have regarding not being in contact with a parent, or a parent refusing to share their information?
I'll tackle this one, Ray. There's the answer today and the answer in the new legislation, right? So without going sort of into another whole presentation about what's coming in the new FAFSA Simplification Act, immediately what it will solve are things like, in the current situation, for example, married parents filing separately could not use the DRT. That will not be the case moving forward. So if there is a set of parents who choose the married filing separately option for their taxes, and that's whose information belongs on the FAFSA, things like that are now going to be able to come over from the IRS. Not being in touch with the student, if it's a situation where the student cannot meet independent criteria and they need parent information, the new process is not completely laid out, but glimpses of what we saw happening is, even though you may not have contact with that parent, if that's whose information needs to be on the form, they're going to have to complete, they'll have to log in with an FSA ID and give permission to have their information come over. So if they're willing to do that, then it will be an electronic process. There still will be the difficult situation of parents who do not want to provide their tax information, and if they are unwilling to do that, unwilling to create their FSA IDs and go in and log in and give permission to have their information transferred, the students may be, sort of addressing that option that says they're unable to provide parent information, parent refusal. Unfortunately, that puts the student in the situation in the future of only being eligible at the federal level for unsubsidized loans. They may still qualify for, merit-based aid and things like that at their institutions, but in the federal world, parent refusal is going to only lead them down the path of unsubsidized loans.
Yeah, okay. Donna is sharing when you were asking about sort of what some of our folks were seeing, and I suspect you've probably saw this across the country. Her freshman or class of 2020 this year were challenged by providing updated docs for being homeless or and or unaccompanied.
That I mean, I can say that does not shock me because getting documentation is probably the toughest challenge
Hmm.
that people have experienced this year. So whether there were folks, the directors at the shelters and things like that who may have been able to provide a letter. Many of our students were not in school. Their McKinney-Vento liaison was not someone they could have regular contact with. So I am very hopeful that as many school districts are beginning to return in person or at least hybrid, that students may have access to the counselor or the McKinney-Vento liaison or somebody like that who can get them the necessary documentation for their status.
Yeah. Okay. Cammie's wondering, could you be more specific about the statement the student can sign in lieu of the verification of non-filing? Is that a form, or does the student just compose a letter?
Um, it, Most colleges have created a form or added a section onto their verification worksheet where if the student was a non-filer, they can check a box and do a signature. Some have made the form a separate statement, document form that they can download and indicate, and some take a written signed statement. So it varies, my one college at a time phrase
Yeah,
varies by college.
yeah. So this one's related back to, unaccompanied and homeless students. This is Randy who's asking, even prior to COVID, many of their students find it impossible to get the VONF letter. She or he works with students, homeless students. So many are unaccompanied and they have great difficulty getting the letter. Any suggestions?
Yeah, that statement should work. The statement, as I mentioned before, that kind of relief was issued by the department ahead of COVID, not in
Okay.
anticipation of COVID. So really, about 3 or so months ahead of COVID, when they were at their annual federal student aid conference in what would have been December of 19, they were encouraging colleges to accept the signed tax reforms and the signed, any kind of signed statements and letters. And so, if because many of those independent students or homeless students can be independent, they were the ones that needed. Dependent students didn't need verification, and so the independent did, which is why it was tough. But that signed statement available from their college should be their alternate route to getting
Okay,
all the documentation on file.
great. How early would you, Joelle's asking, how early would you recommend students reach out to College Financial Aid office to be proactive in asking about any verification or documentation they may need?
Uh, well, it can't be obviously before they file the FAFSA.
Hmm.
And like I said, many colleges have different cycles. There are colleges that I would call it like admissions. They do a rolling verification notification as they bring in FAFSAs and load them into their system each week or things like that. They may go right out with communications to the students that you were selected and here's what you need to do at our institutions. Others will hold, maybe particularly in the fall, they may hold all FAFSAs received per se through, for example, December. And then finally in December, they'll send their first batch of information out to the students saying you were selected for verification. Here's the process, here's the portal, here's how you upload, those kind of things. So, the student may, as soon as they get their student aid report, and if they see that asterisk, that could be their signal if they want to reach out and ask what's the process going to be or what's it going to be like at your school. I'm sure the financial aid folks will be happy to answer that, but it may be an immediate answer. It may be we'll be sending notifications to all of our students selected in January for you to upload your verification documents.
Yeah. Okay. Just a quick reminder to folks in Florida, about half of the school districts in Florida have access to FAFSA specific student-specific FAFSA completion information. So check with your district to see if they have it. If they don't, there's a fairly straightforward process they can work on with OFSA, the Office of Financial Student Aid in Tallahassee, in order to get access to that student level data so you can be more targeted in how you support students. Okay, this question I know we all want to know. It's like the Wizard of Oz behind the curtain, and there's probably a limit to how you can answer this, but I'll throw it out there anyway. Since not all students are selected for verification, how do they determine who and why ones are selected, or is it just random?
Your analogy was great. It's like the wizard behind the curtain. You know, I have worked in this career for a long time, and I started my career in a financial aid office. If there's one piece of top secret, probably better than CIA kept secrets, is the algorithms that federal student aid uses to select students for verification. None of us have ever seen them. I guess maybe someday we could all apply to work over there and work in the department that writes the criteria or understands that machine learning model, so we can know who they select. But none of us have ever seen the algorithms or the requirements, because if I did, trust me, I would share as broadly as I could share.
Yeah. And some of it is random. So,
It is
people
random. There
shouldn't
is a percentage for
automatically
random.
feel targeted per se, but sometimes there's legitimate questions in terms of information that's been turned in.
Yeah. I mean, I'll give one example that we know is probably a very highly likely selection. There are some families that choose, although there's married parents, and maybe only one of them is employed, and so the other person files as head of household. And there'll be some warning messages that will come up when you're attempting to file your FAFSA if you've said married and you've said head of household. But if you can persist through those warning messages, I am pretty sure that if I were ever got access to those algorithms, I would see that if a FAFSA came through with a set of married parents and someone filed as head of household, that is probably a key for
Yeah.
getting selected for verification, because the financial aid office is going to have to unravel if there are some exceptions when that can happen, but that is not a typical standard allowed tax filing status. So
Yeah.
that
Okay.
one probably gets you selected 99.9% of the time.
Okay. John is asking me to repeat that organization with the state. So it's OFSA, OFSA, Office of Financial Student Aid, I believe, assistance, I think is what it stands for. And the parents don't have access to that, but the school districts can get access. So if your district does not already have that data sharing agreement in place, I encourage you to do that, because that's super important. Sarah's asking, I have a student that gets selected for verification for citizenship every year. She's naturalized. Is it because of that?
Yes, it may be one of the parameters that gets them selected, and you know, depending on what their sort of citizenship status is, determines whether they have to, in the past, appear in person and show appropriate documentation, or now allows, copies of things to be submitted. So that may be it. There may be something as they do all the matches to Homeland Security and the Social Security Administration and all those good kind of things. There may be something in their algorithm that is selecting that student.
Yeah. Okay. And briefly, what are some tips that you can share regarding writing supporting documentation letters for students with verification? I know it depends on what is being verified, but are there certain things that get flagged often?
Well, yeah, you may see, particularly the situation where a student doesn't have access to parent information, or things like that. The thing I would say about the letters, I mean, sometimes we feel like we don't want to ask intrusive questions of the students. We want to be supportive. We want to write a letter, but we don't want to ask intrusive questions. Unfortunately, it's the intrusive questions that will give you the information to write the best type of support letter. You can't you can't speak in generalizations in the support letter, because if the financial administrator does not understand the situation, the student doesn't have a relationship with their parent, doesn't exactly define, has not had a relationship since they were 8 years old, has a relationship which could cause harm or damage to the student. I mean, you've got to get those additional kind of details in there. And I know it feels like being intrusive and it's so hard to ask the questions, but
It is.
it is to be able to write the letter that gets the student, the aid they probably so deserve.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's really what we're all committed to. Okay, so folks, what's coming up on March 25th is leveraging Black Greek letter organizations to serve underrepresented students. We're specifically going to be welcoming Alpha Kappa Alpha sororities CAP program, so we're excited to share that with you. If you're not already subscribed to our briefings where you'll get updates on upcoming webinars, etc., I encourage you to do that. And many thanks to Morley and Ray for helping us understand how FAFSA verification's changing, especially really getting granular in terms of over 70% of students, their FAFSA amount, their Pell Grant amount doesn't change. So it seems like there's still opportunities for improvement there. So we're excited you're on it. And many thanks to all who have joined us this afternoon. Thanks for tuning in. Stay safe out there, and we hope to see you back soon. Take care now. Bye.
Thank you.